Let me start the proceedings. I won't say very much because we're aiming for a 10 past 10 start. Welcome everybody. Thank you very much for coming here. Thanks in particular to our speakers. In the morning we've got Chris Davidson, Anne Feltham, and shortly to arrive Afzal Amin. Chris Davidson will start, and he's going to talk. He's a reader in Middle East politics at the University of Durham, and he's going to focus on British Middle East policy with particular reference to Saudi Arabia and the Gulf states and the consequences of that. We then have Afzal Amin, who's going to look more broadly at what he regards as the failure of the AFPAC project, the Afghanistan-Pakistan project, and the longer-term consequences that this has had. And then finally, Anne Feltham from the Campaign Against Arms Trade is going to talk about the influence of the arms trade and how that's affected Middle East policy, what the consequences of that have been. So I'll pass over to Chris first of all.
Great. Good morning everyone, and happy St. George's Day, this beautiful day in Leeds. Many thanks to James and everyone at the Arabic department here at Leeds for inviting me. You can probably, for those of you who don't know me, detect a slight Yorkshire accent, so of course it's my great privilege and perhaps duty as well to always accept invitations to speak at Yorkshire institutions. I think given the topic today, regardless of our ideological viewpoints or impressions of the greater Middle East region stretching from North Africa across to the Arabian Peninsula and the Levant, one thing we can perhaps rather very sadly agree on is that things definitely seem to be getting a lot worse, at least over the past few years. We've seen most notably that brief glimpse of hope back in early 2011, the so-called Arab Spring, where we had much emancipatory language. We had people of the region trying to not only reconnect to a more cosmopolitan past, but also try and break themselves free of this sort of post-colonial condition of the last couple of centuries of being overlorded by European empires, and then the post-colonial constructs of these empires, the sort of tyrannies and dictatorships that have served as their clients ever since. We had incredible scenes, of course, in Egypt and Tunisia in particular, with hundreds of thousands, possibly even millions, taking to the streets. Crucially, of course, men, women, children, covered women, uncovered women, Christians, Muslims, etc., in a very wholesome and community-wide rebellious and revolutionary spirit, with demands, of course, that were not necessarily religious, but for basic hopes and freedoms and the progress of humankind. What I also found very interesting about that period in the Arab world was how these movements tried to connect themselves to other movements elsewhere in the world. We saw people walking around with t-shirts emblazoned with 1848. We saw secular slogans, socialist slogans, even communist slogans. We also saw the rest of the world start to borrow from the Arab Spring as well, ranging from the protests outside the Capitol building in Wisconsin that you may remember, to the 15th of March movement against austerity in Spain, to, of course, ultimately the Occupy Wall Street movements later that year that spread elsewhere around the world. Much of that, of course, gave way to chaos, civil war, entrenchment of these dictatorships and military deep states, and especially in Libya, Syria, and Yemen, we've seen the almost disintegration of the states. Rather sadly, in parallel to the failure of the Arab Springs, we've also seen the rise of what I think can only be described as some of the most virulent strains of Islamist militancy, going even further than Al-Qaeda in their caves plotting against the world in the past, to full-blown Islamic State that we see with us today. I'm happy, of course, in the Q&A period to talk a bit more about Britain and America's role vis-à-vis Al-Qaeda, Islamic militancy, and now Islamic State. But to tally better with the topic and theme of today's events, I'd like to focus primarily on the role of interventions in the Middle East. The first thing I suppose to note is that the interventions we've seen in the wake of the Arab Spring are in many ways nothing new. Britain, and then in many ways passing the baton to the United States in the mid-20th century, have of course long since intervened in the Middle East and the Arab world. The primary reason for this was often to counter national liberation movements and revolutionary movements that threatened to topple long-standing and loyal and dependable clients of the British and then American empires. This, of course, rather sadly led to the abrupt demise of movements and even democratically elected governments that will never really know how they would have developed if they'd been left unchecked. The reason, the fear, of course, from Britain and America's perspective is that these governments could conceivably create more robust, independent states that wouldn't get caught up in the Cold War dynamic, that would try to engage in things like economic nationalism, in other words, taking possession of assets, including oil companies, etc., which had firmly been in the hands of Britain, the West, and other European powers. We know, of course, from secret communications in the British government and American government from the mid-20th century how dangerous they viewed such nationalist forces as actually being. For example, elsewhere in the British Empire, in the 1950s and 60s, we saw the Malaya emergency, where at that time up to a third of Britain's foreign currency reserves were coming from the export of rubber and tin from Malaya. So that movement needed to be dealt with very firmly too. The secondary fear, of course, was that these neutral states in the Middle East, if these national liberation movements were successful, could potentially then align themselves with competing foreign powers, most notably the Soviet Union, and less likely the People's Republic of China. Of course, in government documentation in the West, politicians in Parliament, etc., and Congress out in the open couldn't come out with it and say that national liberation movements and economic nationalism were the primary drivers behind the need for these interventions. Instead, it had to be masked in the language of the communist bogeyman, that if these movements were not stopped in their tracks, then essentially we'd have the Reds getting their hands on Middle East oil, threatening our very livelihood, and so on. Very sadly, of course, the Middle East was